it's helpful to me in a certain weird way that the Old Testament and the Bible as a whole is like realistic to life.
What do you think happened to people pre-Jesus?
And a lot of people really, really struggle with this. Like, why would God tell Abraham to take his son to the top of a mountain and sacrifice it?
What would you say happens to people who have never heard the Gospels?
Unless you become as a little child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven.
What do you think hell looks like? So the last episode, you made a case for Christ, like I had asked you to. And as I was editing and reviewing the last podcast, I had some follow-up questions. But before I ask you them, I just wanted to recap the 4 points that you gave in the first episode. You said, your first point was that we all make decisions based on what we believe. And you gave a really great example of, if somebody believes that life ends as soon as you die, they might be selfish and greedy because they're just thinking, let me get the most and receive as much as I can, since, there's nothing after this life, which I thought was a really good way of putting it. And your second point, what you explained, why you believe the Bible is true. And your third point was the impact that Christian belief has had on the world and your own personal story. And then the fourth point you made was about Jesus, who he was, what he did for us. So I just wanted to throw that out there just in case anybody didn't listen to the first podcast and they just listened to this one first. Sure. I would encourage them to go back and listen to your explanation and description of those 4 points. So that is what the first podcast was about. And then we talked a little bit about other religions. And I have some of my own thoughts on this stuff.
Sure.
But I want to hear your piece first. So I want to hear what would you say happens to people who have never heard the Gospels and who don't know Jesus?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a very, very relevant question for a lot of people who are working through these kinds of things. I'll start with 2 things, and then feel free to interject with further questions or thoughts. One thing I have is that I just always like to kind of try to differentiate between the Christian faith and pretty much every other religious system that people can have. And so that would kind of mainly include Islam, Judaism, Hinduism. A main differentiating factor is that in Christianity, the belief is not that we do something to earn our way to God, but rather that God came and sacrificed to give us a pathway back to God, that he kind of took the separation between God and man on his shoulders and bridged the gap for our good. Whereas all of the other kind of major big religions, and even in a certain sense, if you think of secularism, so this idea that scientism, secularism, whatever you want to call it, this idea that we only live till we die and that's all. Even if you include that, pretty much every other system of human life involves some version of, I have to be good enough in order to get what I deserve. And so Islam says, here's these pillars and you have to achieve them in order to get to Allah. Judaism, similarly, is kind of, the Old Testament Bible that says, here's the law, follow these 613 laws, and you can get to God as best as possible. Hinduism is kind of like, as long as you can kind of mentally get to this place where you transcend the suffering of the world, you'll be at a peaceful place, but that's kind of on you. And even secularism basically says, and especially nowadays, I'm sure people, if they're listening to a podcast, are aware that there's a lot of people talking about all of the ins and outs of how you can live the most efficient, healthy life based on all of the protocols and actions you need to do. And so I just like to differentiate Christianity as kind of, you want to do good for God, but you don't have to do good because God already did the good for you. Right. It's a giant gulf in between those 2 things. So that's one thought about that topic that you brought up. And then your kind of more specific question was about what happens to somebody who doesn't get confronted by the question of Christianity, and kind of how does God perceive them in the afterlife. And so my first fundamental answer to that is that all decisions about who gets kind of into a positive sense of eternity with God are on God's shoulders and not on mine.
Right.
And so I like to approach that kind of thing from a place of humility rather than from a place of judgment, as if I am God. I can talk about what the Bible has to say about that, and I can talk about kind of what a lot of Christian theologians have to say about it. But fundamentally, I want to say that more than anything else, like, I'm entrusting myself to God, who can do all the fancy calculus and math and details for every individual to determine kind of where how that works out for them. Specifically in the Bible, especially in the early chapters of the book of Romans, which is in the New Testament written by Paul, he kind of defines the fact that, especially Romans 1 would be a good place to read, that for a lot of folks, you can kind of have a sense of the order and rightness and wrongness of the world just by living in the world, kind of without necessarily getting any technical instructions. A lot of people have this God-given, because the Christian belief is we're made in the image of God, this God-given ability to see right and wrong, and that we are responsible to that level. It goes on, interestingly, in the book of Romans to say that there's almost like a stronger level of responsibility to those, especially he's kind of speaking into the Jewish history of his people, to those who have given more specific instruction from God. And so one of the ways that Christians project this poorly is that we kind of pretend like everyone else is guilty and we're pretty good.
Yeah.
But according to Romans 1-3, it kind of says those who have heard are kind of more responsible before God. There's a passage, to whom much is given, much is required, is this idea that, like, those are more responsible, and then there is still some level of responsibility for those who have not. You live in wherever, the Amazon or whatever, and, before any missionary went there. I just trust that to God, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yeah, my thoughts were similar as far as, like, God's the judge, not us.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, and I think that I don't think he judges us the same, but I think he judges us all fairly.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And to add, like, I wouldn't exactly say he judges fairly, because, again, to go back to the difference between Christianity and everybody else, is like, already the concept of Christianity is that no person, whether they heard about God or didn't hear about God, whatever, no person is anywhere near good enough to be with God. Mm-hmm. And so he judges with the ability, like, with grace. Like, he judges with, like, anybody who's in is an undeserved thing. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of, a lot of folks struggle because as humans, we all tend towards this thing that says, you do right, you get good, you do wrong, you get bad. And Christianity fundamentally pushes back against that. I had one other thought I was going to say about that. Good, what were you going to say? And then maybe it'll come back to me.
No, I was just going to agree with what you were saying. When I said, judges fairly, I meant, like, based on your knowledge. Right. I don't know exactly what verse it is, but, it talks about in the Bible how all children will enter the kingdom of heaven. Mm-hmm. So, and it's because of their innocence, and, they might not have as much knowledge as we do. I have heard before, and I don't know where this came from, but people who don't know Jesus are basically as innocent as a child. So I would think that those people would go to heaven as well, because they don't have that knowledge to push back against. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I have two thoughts. I remember what I was going to say, which relates exactly to what you just said. So, two thoughts. The verse you're looking for it says, unless you become as a little child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven, which means that there's something about that innocence or the general trust that a young child would have in somebody, their ability to place their trust outside of themselves, that God is a big fan of. And then as far as kind of how this works, God is super, super, super wise, wiser than we can even imagine. And so he can be gracious as he wants to be gracious to allow people to spend eternity within him in heaven. Another way that some people think about this, which has been helpful for me over the years, C.S. Lewis writes a lot about this idea, is that one of the ways to think about the difference between kind of participating in heaven versus participating in hell is that for some people, based on the way they live their lives, the experience of heaven would actually be hell to them. What I mean by that is this. Those people, they are so afraid of the idea of grace. And they're so afraid of the idea of unearned goodness. And they don't like to receive grace from others, but they also hate to give grace to others.
Yeah.
Right? There's no space in their world for forgiveness, for reconciliation. It's kind of, everything is to the extreme level of black and white. And if someone, did something that was unhealthy, like there's no room to forgive that person, that individual would struggle in a gracious eternity in heaven, because they couldn't reconcile that sense of things with the abundant, lavish graciousness and goodness of God. And so it's helpful for me to think that everyone's becoming a certain kind of person. If you're becoming a more loving, generous to others, self-sacrificing for the good of those around you kind of person, then you're becoming the kind of person who fits in heaven better. Mm-hmm. But if you're becoming the kind of person who's more self-focused, who's more unhealthy, who treats others with more unhealth, you're like becoming the kind of person who couldn't handle the experience of heaven. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense, and I know people like that, and I guess other than leading by example and praying for people like that, who are like kind of revenge minded things like that, what can we do to help them to see the other side, what you're describing as grace and forgiveness and understanding?
I mean, Jesus, John 1 would talk about Jesus being full of grace and truth. And what's really awesome about that is we tend towards one side or the other. We tend towards, every human that I know either kind of has a proclivity towards truth or a proclivity towards grace. They're a kind, nice person, but they don't stand up for themselves. Or they speak the truth and yell at people and I'm right and wrong, but they don't have a grace side to them in that. And so I think the vision is to kind of look people clearly in the eyes and speak the truth, but still in a tone and in a way that says, I'm for you and I want your good. And I think that's surprising to some folks. Like a lot of folks, well, if I made you mad, you should be mad at me. So I don't know what to do if you're like still coming at me and seeming to naturally want my good. Like it kind of, in a very odd way, like messes with people. Yeah. To be like, well, you should hate me now, but you actually like me, but you're still saying something that I disagree with. So like, I don't know what to do about that. Something like that seems like a helpful response to what you just described. Yeah. I mean, I ain't perfect about it, but.
Right. In every you could go into a bunch of like what ifs and
situations. Depending on the situation.
Right.
And depending on if that person is more of the grace side where you might need to be more courageous in truth, or more of the truth side and you might need to be kind of show them more overflowing and abundant grace.
And then, so you described your idea of heaven. What do you think hell looks like?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good question too. A couple thoughts. I'm just going to do maybe a few teasers here, and people can kind of do some research on your own, because I don't probably have time to go into super depth, and I'm not. Yeah, so I'll just start with this. Okay, so hell by definition is kind of separation from God. A lot of folks, very, very, very unhelpfully, and you can trace this historically back to a book by Dante called Dante's Inferno, which is kind of the first place, significantly after the Bible, which associated hell with like fire and a devil as red with a pitchfork and like the image that everybody has. Yeah. And so I like to push back against that and say that a lot of that imagery, and you sometimes hear people saying like they live a terrible life. Well, you're gonna at least you have a whole bunch of fun with your friends in hell, this kind of thing, and they just kind of picture it as sort of this rowdy party for all the craziest, unhealthiest folks or something like that. And I think, unhelpfully, some of that is just a cultural picture from Dante, not from the Bible. And so Jesus spoke, a lot of people, again, to go back to Jesus and grace and truth, a lot of people say Jesus was like very gracious. He died for us. He's sacrificial. That he's loving. This kind of thing. He spoke about hell a lot, and I like to make that point because I think a lot of folks disregard that piece of what Jesus said because they want to paint him in a certain way that's just nice and kind and kind of gentle and a pushover in a way. He spoke about hell a lot, and when he spoke about it, he's especially talking about this idea of Gehenna, which was really represented like a burning trash pit outside the city of Jerusalem. And there's a lot of imagery, and it ties to Old Testament imagery, and there's kind of some details that I'm not really at a place, or do we have time to go into all the details about that, but I'd encourage people to look up Gehenna and think about what Jesus, like look for the biblical passages, what Jesus said about hell, because I guess my sense of things, Fern, is that one of the things about hell is that it's isolation from relationship. And so sin, by definition, it breaks your relationship with yourself, your relationship with other people, your relationship with creation, and your relationship with God. Mm-hmm. That's what sin does. And so the idea of the gospel through Jesus is that restores all four of those categories of relationships. And so heaven is the place where you have a very healthy self-identity relationship to self, a very healthy relationship to other people, a very healthy relationship with creation, and a very healthy relationship with God. Well, then hell is the exact opposite of that. And so I think isolation and broken relationship those are the ways that I would kind of define it more so than this idea of the burning red laughing pit. That's not so biblical as it is from other books that written later.
That was my idea too. I don't know that it's just like torture for eternity in a way of like physical torture. Like I think, like you said, it's distance from God.
Sure. And another very similar way to talk about it is like if you picture the kind of person who is as selfish and narcissistic and whatever as they can possibly be, and they're like that, and then you extend that out over a long, long, long period of time, and you just allow them to like reap the results of continual selfish narcissism. Right. It's like, just picture what that looks like over a long period of time, and like, it's just, nothing really good or healthy. It's just brokenness and unhealth sprouting all around from that person, which is kind of the opposite of the experience of glory with God.
Yes. So going back to I just asked you, about people who have never heard the Gospels or who don't know Jesus, but what about what do you think happened to people pre-Jesus?
Yeah, got it. That's a good question. So some of this relates to your view on God and time, and so I'll go way back to the beginning, Genesis 3, I think it's 15 or 16, I think it's 15. This is after the fall of Adam and Eve. There's like a little poem that talks about the curse of God against humanity because they rebelled against God by eating the forbidden fruit. There's a verse in there that says, an offspring of Eve, to some effect I'm not going to quote it off the top of my head exactly right, but it's like Satan will bite his heel, but this offspring of Eve will crush the serpent's head. And most everybody thinks that that's kind of the first biblical reference to Jesus. In other words, it's talking about this, coming Savior who's going to put things right and defeat the liar of all liars at some point. And so then there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots more passages all through the Old Testament that are pointing towards, and so Genesis 3 is early human history, but all pointing towards this idea of a Savior. Eventually, you throw around the word Messiah as that coming Savior. And so all these things are all talking about the coming Savior. And so I would argue easily that God had in mind the salvation for his people. And so I think because of God being able to know the future, he could apply the coming grace of Christ to people before Christ was actually here. Does that make sense what I'm saying there?
It does make sense. And this might come off a little, I don't know how people will take it, but like, sure. I feel like in the Old Testament, God seems kind of mean. And then, like, we get to Jesus, and he's supposed to be God, or he is God.
Yeah.
And he's, like, loving and graceful and, like, all the things we just described.
That's super, super helpful. Yeah. It's a great question because it's an honest question, and that's why I love great questions. That's why I'm a big fan of yours, friend. I have a book around a bookshelf called something like, Is God a Moral Monster? And what it's trying to unpack is exactly the question you're asking, which is, if you look at the Old Testament specifically, and I think one of the hardest, and I'll just be honest here, one of the hardest books to reconcile with is the book of Joshua, where the Israelites go into the promised land and kind of kill all the other people because it's like their promised land. It sounds like some kind of militaristic deal. And so I think you're right, that's something to be reconciled with. The most, let's say, philosophical response I could give to that is that according to accurate, I guess, Christian theology, would say something like, all of us, because we all rebel against God, what we deserve is immediate death and eternal suffering. So the foundational level of what any human being deserves is immediate death and eternal suffering. Now, there's an idea called common grace, and common grace is this idea that, whether people believe in God or not, while they live their life on earth, God provides rain to grow crops so they can eat some food. God provides sunshine to sustain life. God provides for those people sometimes, a great marriage or love of their kids or the ability to do something helpful, even if they don't believe in Jesus. And so there's an idea that, but all those things are still what's called common grace. They're still out of the grace of God. And so then, to go back to your question about God seeming mean in the Old Testament, it's kind of like, well, God's by right, as the holy God, that he created us and we rebelled against him. He has the ability to destroy those things. And so I'm not removing our 2024 sense that seems mean. I'm just saying that if you philosophically look at it, like, we can't really define anything that God does as mean, because God is God and he's able to do what he wants. Now, with all of that being said, I would strongly argue, very, very strongly argue, that there are a bazillion examples of glimpses of grace all through the Old Testament. For example, just one quick example, and I'll shut my mouth, is Genesis 22 is the near sacrifice of Isaac. And a lot of people really, really struggle with this. Like, why would God tell Abraham to take his son to the top of a mountain and sacrifice him?
Right.
Well, that was abundantly common in all of the cultures around there. What's interesting about that is that, we look at that and say, well, what kind of, like, I don't want to follow a God that's, but all of the gods at that time, like, that'd be, it wouldn't, nobody would bat an eye at the idea that a God was calling somebody to sacrifice a human to worship that God at that space. What's unique about the God of the Bible is that then he provides a ram caught in a thicket to act as a substitutionary sacrifice instead of Isaac. That's all a precursor to Jesus' substitutionary sacrifice for us that God called so that we don't have to sacrifice. And the point that I'm making is, like, that could be seen as an act of grace by God, even in the midst of something that seems so terribly ugly to our modern eyes.
So, are you saying that in that time period, the gods that people believed were asking them to sacrifice their children, and our God, the true God, is saying the same thing and then showing grace? He's flipping the switch, basically.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I wish that when I'm reading the Bible, that's how I was thinking.
And it's hard partly because, obviously, one of the challenges of Bible reading is, like, you're not in the original context that the thing is written. And you're not reading it in the original language that it's written. And so there's some work on our end that we have to do in interpreting all that. But I would encourage anybody listening, if you want to see kind of a little bit of the context, that I think it's the Amorite god Molech, Molech, and read about how people worshipped Moloch is, it's craziness. It's just craziness. Yeah, I'll stop there. I have some more thoughts, but the big picture I'm trying to say is that through the Old Testament, there's a great story of, I'm going to say it anyhow, it's the story of Joseph. Joseph gets sold into slavery. He goes to Egypt. There's a giant mess. Like, long story short, through Joseph, God saves the people of that region by saving them from a famine that would kill them. And so Joseph is another prototype of Jesus, because he goes into slavery, and then God uses that to save a whole bunch of other people.
He suffers
he temporarily suffers, that then brings life to other people, same as Jesus. And so there's this ongoing pattern of that sort of thing through the Old Testament, and it's almost like the bleakness. Judges is another one. If you read the book of Judges, it cycles. Things seem to get worse, but God shows up and brings some help or good, even in the midst of things being terrible.
Yeah.
So I keep saying I should stop, but one last thing now is that it's helpful to me in a certain weird way that the Old Testament and the Bible as a whole is like realistic to life.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still suffering going on now. We got a relatively recent assassination attempt on a former president, and there's wars happening in the world now, and the Bible doesn't kind of pussyfoot around that stuff and just talk about everything as if it's just easy and good, and humans aren't complex and unhealthy in all sorts of crazy ways.
Right.
And if you read through the Old Testament, like, over and over and over again, you get that. Mm-hmm. And we push back against it because we don't want to say that that's us.
Right.
But in a certain sense, it is us. So it makes the grace all the better when we see the unhealth as realistic and bad as it actually is.
Mm-hmm. I know we don't have a lot more time, and this is another one of my comments that might sound a little like maybe people were afraid to say it.
Yeah, that's go for it.
Adam and Eve sinned, but I wasn't there, and you weren't there. Mm-hmm. Like, we were just like born into it.
Sure.
And I don't know, maybe I don't think I'm the only person that maybe has thought that.
Yeah,
before.
definitely not.
I know that there is probably a great explanation for it. I just am curious what you think of, the idea of, like, Adam and Eve ate the fruit from the tree that they weren't supposed to eat from, that God told them not to. But if I was Eve, would I have inevitably done the same thing? Or?
It's a great question. I could approach this from several different ways.
Yeah, I kind of figured.
One way is to say something like, which a lot of people would ask this question, like, why did God put that tree in the garden? Like, why doesn't it just make it awesome and good for everybody all the time?
Yeah. Safe for the choice.
And the best answer to that is that we need a freedom to choose right and wrong in order to choose love and goodness.
Yes.
I mean, a world of robots. I mean, we're looking ahead at AI craziness and stuff like that, and it's like a world of robots that just do what they're told. Like, it's a world, but it's not a world of love. Like, it can't be a world of love, even though it has to risk being a world of sin. Mm-hmm. So that's one thought. And then the thought about, there's a lot of different people who are really, really, really bright about the kinds of questions you're asking. Mm-hmm. William Lane Craig is one I would recommend if anybody's listening and wants to check that out. What he has to say about Adam and Eve is complex and interesting, and I think kind of helpful. But I guess maybe my most fundamental answer for it is something like, it's been borne out to be true. If the question is something like, well, Adam and Eve walked past the tree of knowing good and bad, and they took of that because what they wanted to do is they wanted to define for themselves what was right and wrong instead of trusting what God thought was right and wrong. I think almost every single person can say that there are instances in their life where they have said, I think this is right. In other words, I'm going to do this, right? Even if it's against what God would ideally want for me, I'm going to choose to define this as good, even though God does not define it as good. And then we run into the consequences of those things, because we're selfish, or we hurt a relationship, or we lie to save face, or we, like, whatever things we do. And so it's like one of those deals where, technically, how does it get passed down from Adam and Eve to the rest of humanity? That's your question.
Yeah.
And I would say it's like, I don't exactly know, like, I don't know that it's in genetics. I don't know, but I just think it's common if you look at humans. Like, I don't know of anybody, and then the Christian claim is just that because Jesus was born of God directly, and Mary was a virgin, that allows him to be uniquely, away from that same curse that we all have. And so
are you saying that, like, I was born, you were born innocent, and maybe we didn't eat from the tree of good and evil, but we chose another sin to partake of?
Yeah, that's what I would say. I think the tree of good and bad is like, I think it was a thing that actually happened, but I think it's speaking more deeply about a human experience that happens, like, ongoing, happens for all humans.
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of telling us the story of the core story of the problem of our lives. Another person, I'm a big fan of listening to Jordan Peterson stuff, and he has a lot of really, really interesting things to say.
Yeah.
He's a little bit more,
I know.
I guess, non-literal about some of these things, but he thinks very, very deeply about the implications of kind of the original sin story and how that, in an ongoing way, affects all of our lives. And I found that to be helpful because it sort of ties me in a way to that story, instead of saying, well, it's their fault, and because they messed up, now I have to suffer the consequences. Like, because we all mess up in that same way, we all suffer the consequences.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And how that gets passed down from generation to generation. I mean, another thing I'm freakishly curious about nowadays is the implications of parenting on kids, and how trauma or issues with how parents did or did not, mostly did not love you perfectly, affect how we grow up and the unhealthy actions we take. That's another piece of this whole thing. It's like Adam and Eve, then they had kids, and like they bring their sinness into their parenting, and then that brings and so on and so forth. And this is why some of the most challenging kids who God loves dearly come from the unhealthiest home environments.
Yeah.
Like I think there is a connection there, if what I'm saying there makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's about all we have time for.
I think Fern and I are both really, really hyped to keep going, but we're going to stop it for now.
Put an end to this.
Yeah, right.
But we'll be doing a lot more of these podcasts. I think this was a really good one.
Yeah,
we're at a good place to stop.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good stuff to talk about.
Yes. So just wanted to reemphasize that you guys can leave comments on the YouTube channel, and or reach out to Luke or I if you have our phone numbers.
Yeah, we'd love to answer. I oftentimes use the phrase, like, I'd much rather answer real questions than like make up hypothetical questions in my head to try to answer. And this is one of the reasons why it's awesome to have Fern here, because she has great questions. But anybody else that does, we'd love to hear. So.
All right.
Thanks, Fern.